The GM Intermediates were all new for the 1973 model year, and Olds introduced a new model to the Cutlass franchise, and that was the Oldsmobile Cutlass Salon. In 1973, it was only available as a four-door sedan. By the way, on these Intermediates, there were no longer were hardtop bodies. These sedans had a distinctive pillar, as did the coupes. And these are the so-called Colonnade cars, where Colonnade is just that architectural term for the arch and then the columns that go on either side of it. And you can kind of see that in the profile of these vehicles. But the Cutlass Salon was meant to be a different vehicle from the overall Cutlass, which came in a number of different trims for 1973. The Cutlass S, which was basically the standard Cutlass, as well as the Cutlass Supreme, the more luxurious Cutlass. The Salon was meant to be, and don't laugh at this, Oldsmobile's little Mercedes. And to the point that, as you'll see, Oldsmobile even advertised that this was made to be a car that was competitive with other European makes. And it wasn't just all talk. Remember, to this point, a lot of domestic cars had this reputation for being floaty boats that didn't handle very well, and the performance wasn't great. But the little Cutlass actually was a pretty good performer overall. Not quite up to a Mercedes 450 SEL. And it actually had decent handling, especially the Salon that had revised shocks and suspension and stabilizer bars, to the point that you really couldn't laugh at it being compared to a Mercedes. But let's talk a little bit more about the Cutlass Salon in detail and talk about some of the top 10 facts that you may not know about it. Let's begin with number 10. Let's begin with number 10, and that is the genesis of the so-called Colonnade styling on these new Intermediates. When these Intermediates were introduced for 1973, there were no more hardtops, and it would take a few more years for General Motors to sunset hardtops on the full-size vehicles as well. But in 1977, GM's full-size lineup would no longer include hardtops either. And in general, the industry was moving away from this. Ford made its last full-size four-door hardtop in 1974, for example. Part of the reason for this was that automakers thought that there were going to be impending rollover standards imposed on vehicles that they just couldn't meet unless the cars had pillars in them. And this was one of the reasons why a number of auto companies like General Motors started advertising the 1976 convertibles that they were producing as the so-called last convertibles, because they just weren't going to be able to meet the rollover standards with something that had a canvas top in it. And so the Colonnade style then just permeated the lineups of General Motors vehicles as well as Ford and Chrysler. Chrysler was the latest to really adopt the overall styling, as they still had a four-door hardtop that was available through the 1978 model year. And hardtops were expensive to produce as well, and they tended to have less overall security. They were easier to break into because they didn't have the pillar. You could kind of just move the glass around and unlock the door if you were an astute thief. And they had, in some cases, more rattles and less structural rigidity too. So the overall hardtop went by the wayside, and for GM at least, these Colonnade cars replaced them, at least in the intermediate size lineup. Let's move on to number 9, and that is that the Olds Cutlass Salon was the first Oldsmobile to have the international flags placed on it. Now, as time would go on, the Oldsmobile Cutlass franchise would be expanded beyond the base Cutlass, the Cutlass S, the Cutlass Supreme, the Cutlass Salon. Oldsmobile had kind of a Cutlass for everything. It was going to be, I guess, the Cutlass 98 before long. And part of that was that Oldsmobile wanted to capitalize on the publicity of the Cutlass soon becoming America's best-selling car, in part because it had so many different trim variants, but also in part because it was just a good vehicle overall. They were reliable, they drove well, they were quiet, they were smooth, they were priced right. It was really kind of that sweet spot that they hit for America at the right time, just the right vehicle at the right time, and a lot of people were happy with their Oldsmobile Cutlasses. I have a 73 Oldsmobile Cutlass S. I can tell you, it's actually a great car to drive. The balance between ride and handling is very good. The steering is, at least for the time, very precise, although it doesn't have any road feel. It's got good power, and it's quiet and smooth. It's pretty hard to improve upon for a base car. But getting back to this international series of flags, well, Oldsmobile would later have the international series like on the Cutlass Supreme, and they'd use that logo in the 80s. But in 1973, the Cutlass Salon was the first Oldsmobile to have that little strip of flags that were placed on the body side. Next, at number 8, we have that the Cutlass Salon had body-colored wheel covers. Now, this was something that was unique to the Cutlass Salon in the Oldsmobile lineup. If you got the regular Cutlass, you got a standard wheel cover that didn't look bad. But if you upgraded to the Salon, you got the body-colored wheel covers. And why was that? Well, who else had body-colored wheel covers? That is Mercedes. And perhaps this is the first time in Oldsmobile history that Oldsmobile tried to emulate Mercedes to some degree, not only with the body-colored wheel covers, but also in the ride and handling balance that they endowed the Cutlass Salon with. But I always thought it was interesting that they had these body-colored wheel covers. Other automakers kind of followed suit. Even in 1973, if you got a Mercury Marquis with the Glamour metallic paint, you got a body-colored wheel cover, like the full body-colored wheel cover. They did have some body-colored wheel covers before that, but the 73 was the first one where it really just took up the whole wheel cover. So a lot of automakers were starting to emulate Mercedes, just kind of a sign of the times that they were becoming an increasingly popular luxury vehicle. And hey, why not have a mid-price car emulate a very expensive car? Let's move on now to number 7, and that is that the Cutlass Salon had its dimmer switch on the steering column. This is one of the first American vehicles to replace that bright light switch that was in the floor with a dimmer switch that was attached to the steering column. And the same was true of the Pontiac Grand Am that was also introduced for 1973. But interestingly, Oldsmobile only had a half-hearted attempt at this column-mounted dimmer switch in 1973. If you got the regular Cutlass S or the Supreme, you got the standard foot-activated bright light dimmer switch. But if you got the Cutlass Salon, you got the dimmer switch on the steering column. So I guess it just was in keeping with the European style of the Cutlass Salon. Now, not quite sure which you prefer. I prefer the dimmer switch on the steering column. I think the foot-operated one isn't bad, but I have a feeling that particularly in Midwestern climates where there's a lot of snow and salt, that activating that switch when your shoe was just caked with salty, snowy, whatever it is, that it probably failed after not that long of a period of time, or they'd become sticky. And so I think that, the column-mounted switch actually made sense. It was pretty easy to operate. But this is the first domestic vehicle that I'm aware of that had this column-operated dimmer switch. Let's move on to number 6. And at number 6, we have the engine lineup for the 1973 Olds Cutlass Salon. And we'll talk a little bit more about that now. So most Oldsmobiles, including the full-size Oldsmobiles, the standard engine was a 350 cubic inch 2-barrel V8. If you got a Delta 88 as an example, that was the standard engine. Of course, if you got the 98, you got the 455 cubic inch V8 standard. But here, for whatever reason, and no matter what Cutlass you got, the standard engine was a 350 4-barrel V8. Even the Cutlass S or the Cutlass, I don't know why Oldsmobile thought it was necessary to give you a 4-barrel standard and not charge extra, but they did. And so I guess that's a good thing for customers because you got a little bit more pep. 180 horsepower was the standard 350 4-barrel engine, made 180 horsepower, and then you could get dual exhaust in that same engine, which would increase the horsepower to 200 horsepower. So you got an extra 20 horsepower just from dual exhaust. Then you could option up to a 455 that made 250 horsepower, and there were even some hotter packages, but those are kind of the mainline packages that you could get for your Oldsmobile. Now, I have to say, I have a 354 barrel on my Cutlass S, and I have put factory-style dual exhaust on it, and the dual exhausts do make a difference, especially at top end. The engine actually pulls at the top end as opposed to kind of petering out. So if that's something and you're looking for a cheap performance upgrade, I can tell you that the dual exhausts do make a difference on these, and the engine just runs great. So that's the engine lineup for these Cutlasses. Let's move on to number 5. And at number 5, we're going to talk about the emission systems for these 1973 Cutlasses. Well, we all know that by this point, automakers were having to consider emission standards, and that drove a number of elements with respect to the car, most notably the carburation, which was becoming increasingly lean in these days before the catalytic converter was introduced, so that automakers could try to meet emission standards. Now, one of the consequences of that is that I would say the 1973 model year cars are kind of the first where no matter what brand that you procure, they kind of start and stumble and have cold weather drivability issues that you just didn't have on the 60s era cars, as an example, or even, the 1971 models, I would say, and 72 models. 73, they're a bit more grumbly and stumbly, and that's because of those emission standards. Now, for instance, when I rebuilt the Quadrajet on my 1973 Cutlass S, I put in smaller metering rods that I believe were 3,000ths or 4,000 smaller metering rods. And that cured all of the cold weather stumbling and hesitation. It basically richened the mixture a little bit. And I should say the primary metering rods. Although you can put richer secondary metering rods as well in your Quadrajet. And you can change the jet sizes around. Lots of different things that you can do. But for me, made a lot of sense to basically have smaller primary metering rods, which allowed more fuel flow. And that not only cured the hesitation and stumbling when the engine was cold, but made the car feel more powerful. The mixture was pretty lean at part throttle until you got to almost half throttle. So the car felt a little bit boggy, and now it just feels a heck of a lot better. Let's move on to number 4, and that is that the Olds Cutlass actually compared favorably to the Mercedes of the time, including the 450 SE. Now, remember, the base price of the Mercedes 450 SE was about $14,000, and for the Olds Cutlass Salon, it was $5,000. So that car cost about 5 times more. It wasn't even close to being in the same price class. And yet, the Oldsmobile really held its own in a number of areas. For instance, take a look at this picture from Car and Driver where they're evaluating the two cars, and they note that the Olds actually was able to pull higher Gs on the skid pad than the Mercedes, 0.7 versus 0.68. Both cars had about the same 0 to 60 time, 10.2 seconds for each of them. And the Olds had an overall quiet ride, even a quieter interior ride than the Mercedes. So it was kind of the equivalent, in some cases better than the Mercedes in a number of respects. Now, of course, the interior materials in the Cutlass and the fit and finish were not the same as the Mercedes 450 SE. And the technology that was employed on the Olds Cutlass was basically antediluvian when you compared it to the Mercedes, or let's just say ancient. It had a live axle rear suspension, did have independent front suspension and disc brakes. The Mercedes had four-wheel independent suspension, an overhead cam engine, so it was very different. But overall, despite the antiquated technology in the Cutlass, it basically acquitted itself well against the Mercedes 450 SE, particularly when you take into consideration that it was a third of the price. So it wasn't all that stretched of a comparison. The car actually handled better on a smooth skid pad versus the Mercedes. If you did have, let's say, a bumpy roadway where the live axle on the Olds would get a little bit excited, that's going to be different than obviously the Mercedes that has independent rear suspension with less unsprung weight. That's going to handle better. But overall, the Olds compared pretty favorably. Let's move on to number 3. And that is that the Cutlass Salon came with these awesome corduroy seats. Now, Cutlass has had some awesome seats during this era. There were the swivel seats that were pretty sweet, something that a number of vehicles had even years prior to the Olds Cutlass getting them. But these corduroy rib seats that came in the Cutlass Salon were really the highlight of the overall vehicle. And they're certainly not European looking overall. I mean, they're fat and they're chunky and oversized, but they were rather effective at keeping you planted in the seat, in part because that corduroy material just stuck to whatever you were wearing. And so it wasn't as though you were driving a car with a vinyl bench seat, where the limiting factor was not necessarily the handling of the car, but how well you could hang on to your seating position given the slipperiness of the surface. These seats proved extremely comfortable, and buyers loved them as well as the magazine testers of the day, and for good reason. They were able to provide good comfort as well as stickiness in the right places. They obviously don't have much lumbar or lateral support, but hey, this was the 1970s and this was an American car, and these seats in this 1973 Cutlass Salon are pretty gosh darn awesome. Let's move on to number 2, and that is that the grills on the Cutlass Salon, as well as the other Cutlasses, are spring-loaded. Yes, I said that right. They're spring-loaded. They are not fixed in place, so that in the event of a car crash, the grill will deflect as the bumper moves back. And that was something that was done to help meet the 5-mile-an-hour impact standard that was introduced in the front in 1973. And Oldsmobile wanted to have this grille that went underneath the bumper. And in order to make sure that that grille wasn't going to get damaged in the process of a 5-mile-an-hour collision, they had to spring load the grille. Now, this was actually a feature that would continue on to Cutlasses all the way up until the end of the rear-wheel drive Cutlasses run in 1988, I believe. So you could actually go and push on the grille and you'd see that it was spring-loaded. And that kind of a cool, neat, quirky feature that often people don't know about, but was also effective in the event of a crash. Let's move on to number 1, and that is the pretty wonky styling proposals that were associated with this Olds Cutlass before the final design was solidified. Now here we have one of the initial proposals for a 73 Cutlass Coupe, and notice this does look somewhat similar but also very different from the final version. First thing to note is you've got quad headlamps that are stacked vertically. This is before they would go to the 2 headlamp design. You do have that Oldsmobile twin port grille up front, a virtually non-existent bumper, so clearly designers were not thinking about the 5-mile-an-hour impact standard at this point. That bumper is purely a decorative piece. You can barely even see it. It's not going to protect against much of anything. And this car seems to be equipped with the Tornado wheel discs from 1967. I guess that this model is done sometime in the late 60s. It's clearly done on, or it's sitting here on GM's design patio at the design center. And you do also see some side surfacing that is very similar to what would end up on the 71 Tornado. That feature line that starts near the headlamp and then continues back into the door and dives downward. That was something that would be found on the 71 Tornado, as well as that rear feature line. So maybe they were trying to give the Cutlass a little bit of Tornado here, perhaps in that surfacing as well as the wheel discs. Now you do have what would become an increasingly GM trait, and that is a very low belt line. This belt line that kind of dips downward from the A-pillar backward. That was something that would become an increasingly GM trait, that low belt line, as they went through the 1980s. And I believe this is a rear of the same car, and notice the quad taillights. This is something that you would see on Oldsmobiles for the 1967 model year as an example, on the Oldsmobile 88, the upper end, custom 88, not on the lower end. You'd have the tail lamps up high as well as in the bumper. I would guess, again, that Oldsmobile was kind of emulating that style here on this Cutlass. Not sure that it works all that well, and again, a purely decorative rear bumper, or nearly decorative rear bumper. Some of this shape to the rear deck lid looks like it made it through into the 73 Grand Prix in Le Mans, and clearly the Olds ended up with the vertical tail lamps, but here they've got this horizontal theme, and like I said, I think the deck lid looks very similar to what would end up on the Pontiac of the era. Here we have a concept sketch done by an individual named Bill Mahalik, who worked in the Oldsmobile studio at the time. Notice the distinctive vertical tail lamps on this particular proposal, as well as those skeg lines that are behind the front wheel, as well as starting in front of the rear wheel and then continuing backward. That would become a characteristic feature of the Cutlass of this generation, and you can see them on this particular sketch, as well as the vertical tail lights. So this is getting closer to the final design theme. There, of course, was not this kind of hot wire bent backlight on the final version of the car, probably for cost reasons, but some things that are similar to the final version you can see here. And lastly, we have this design proposal, which I suspect may have been done first versus the other models, but you have this very sporty profile that would not make it onto the final car, that would become more of a notchback. I think it looks great, though. This rear three-quarter is a very, very handsome view. I love the taillights integrated into the bumper. Again, that would not work out in production, but looks beautiful, especially with those kind of gills or slits for the taillights. And you got a little bit of the four-fendered look on this proposal, too. You can see those bulges around the front wheel as well as the rear wheel. And that was pretty popular for GM styling at the time. This rear three-quarter view also, to my eye, has a little hint of the two-rotor Corvette in it. Maybe somebody else doesn't see that, but I see it, so I'll make note of it. In any case, hope you enjoyed this spotlight on the 73 Olds Cutlass Salon. Let me know what you think. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe.